Hey, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, folks. It's V, the Gorilla Economist, coming to you live on this Monday edition of V for Veles. I apologize, couldn't do it on Friday. I was under the weather. Throat was really closed up and sore, and felt like I was coming down with strep. So to cancel all the shows for Friday, and so we're back on Monday. I can't do much talking without straining my cords. So with that being said, Veles, good morning. How are you, sir? What's going on? Lots to discuss. Where do you want to begin?
I am fine, my friend, and not to worry, because thankfully, given how I do these shows, I'll do a bunch of talking, and you can weigh in when
Perfect.
most appropriate. Yeah, folks. What do you call it? We had to do Monday, as V said. He was a bit under the weather last week, and so was Algo. So we're doing it today on Monday, and then this Friday I've got another obligation, so there'll be no show for me on Friday the 16th. I do hope to be back on the 23rd. We will see. So let us jump into it. It's a surge, according to Zero Hedge this morning. Credit card and auto loan delinquencies surged in the second quarter of this year. What have I shared on Rogue about credit card and related debt? Each of them is nearly $1 trillion each. That's commercial loans, credit cards, college loan debt. I'm not a financial expert, so do your own research and talk to your financial advisor. But we're going to have some themes today as well of a number of things that are not in the media and should be. Eastern Sit Rep. There's a lot to say on this topic, and we'll dig a little bit more into this later. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of things that are mysteriously quiet who shouldn't be at the moment. Have no doubt, everybody, a large portion of the troops who are part of the Ukrainian offensive into the Kursk region are NATO troops. This conflict has gone on for 2.5 years, and now suddenly Ukraine is successfully penetrating Russian territory. In what universe does that happen? Ukraine received better training after 2 years of already being trained? I don't think so.
Well, the 70-year-old men and the teenage 15 and 14-year-old conscripts, they overnight they just got it, fellas. They just got it.
Yeah, and for any of you who've because you have to go to 4chan or similar, or to what do you call it? The friend of the show, Joaquin Flores. If you've gone to those sources, you've seen all the film clips and so on, and the mothers groups in Ukraine who are trying to prevent their kids from being picked up off the street because literally that's the situation. So it's also worth noting that there were already prisoner exchanges a few months ago of Russian troops exchanged for French and British troops who'd been captured. That exchange also included casualties lost in fighting in Ukraine on both sides. The difference in this situation is the Kursk offensive is in Russian territory and not Ukrainian or contested territory. That means a NATO incursion into Russian territory who's about as clear an act of war as there is. If the Russians capture anyone, particularly alive, this will get dicey. This is a classic London corporation move, by the way, where they do something to force someone to act and then play the victim. The Russian government has offered several times over the last few months to negotiate an end to this before it gets out of control. I mean, even Zelensky has said he's willing to have peace negotiations with the Russians present. How novel of him. For some of you who might be aware, prior peace negotiations included everyone but the Russians. Now Zelensky's saying he's willing to let the Russians attend their own peace negotiations. Our friends in London are all in on this stupidity. Why else are they targeting nuclear power plants in the current action? Further, why do you think the U.S. government shut up Scott Ritter to make sure no one offered analysis of this who doesn't meet the party line? Also a bit of history. During World War II, there was a monumental battle at Kursk in the Soviet Union. I say monumental on purpose. Contrary to what the history books will tell you, both German and Soviet forces knew that battle was going to take place and take place most likely in that general vicinity. There were massive losses on both sides, and the Soviet Union prevailed. The battle was seen by many at the time as either Germany would break the Russians or Russia would begin a massive pushback of the Germans all the way to Berlin. The symbolism of this attack is not lost on the Russians by the Lenin Corporation. U.S. media sources are flooding their pages with news about this latest military action for a reading audience who's exhausted. Plus, is this offensive the equivalent of the Germans in 1944 at the Battle of the Bulge, an outcome where it will only hasten the collapse of Ukraine? How crazy has this gotten? Peter Zehan, in a stunning move, stated yesterday he feels Russia's winning the long game.
Because he's listening to us, fellas.
Right. Yet another moment where we have to pray we get through this in one piece.
Yeah.
Space. It appears our astronauts on the ISS may be stuck there till February of 2025, and that's no joke. To be fair, the risk tolerance for getting cargo to the space station is higher than human life and getting that life back on Earth. That said, this is literally what occurred to the Soviet Union towards the latter time of its existence. Astronauts who were literally stuck in space. In fact, there was the famous moment where the Soviet Union had astronauts on the Mir, and then in the 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union, they landed in a country that wasn't the same country they took off from. Or behind door number 3, we could swallow our pride a bit and ask the Russians if they have something lying around who could get our astronauts back. Of course, given the situation in Kursk, I'm sure that's a non-starter. This is either a monumental failure of contingency planning, or I'll go there. This is some sort of action by the globalists relating to sacred beliefs and astrologies we don't understand, kind of like the closing ceremonies of the Olympics once again. British hate speech. For all the predictable responses by the Americans to what's going on in the UK regarding posted speech, we have to look deeper. First, I would reply to my English overlords, whatever speech I've posted is irony or ridicule or humorous license, and I'm also using it to show the wrongness of the view I'm posting. I'm just saying you have options, folks. In all seriousness, though, this has little to do with the statements about migrants. That's the distraction. This is to lay the groundwork so that when the London Corporation rolls out whatever is next in the UK and Commonwealth countries, there's no means to criticize it. For those of you who may not have seen some of the commentary we've been having on Discord, this has reached such absurdity that now the British are saying if you're an American and you post something they consider hate speech on British social media, they will issue an arrest warrant for you.
What and how?
Does it matter?
People are insane.
Where's by the way, when are we going to get Gus back on the air? Can someone find Gus?
Very soon, possibly next week.
Okay. Smithers, release the hounds. It's awfully quiet. Speaking of the UK and disinformation in the media, from a listener of the show and a close friend of mine comes this observation. Did any of you notice how quiet the British royal family has been of late? Yes.
Extremely quiet.
Yes. And Will and Kate made a statement about the Olympics yesterday, and we pulled a photo of Kate out of a photo album. Even the 2 refugees out there in California have been keeping a low profile. That's by design, folks, and remember that. A high-profile red painting, some bleeding horses running down the streets of London, and then crickets. That doesn't just happen. We also said on Rogue maybe 2 or 3 months ago that you would probably see that the royal family would basically go into hiding.
Yep.
A victory. Maryland has reversed course on electric school buses. The state inspector general found problems both with holding the vendor accountable for delivery timetables and the functionality of the electric buses after they were delivered. The state is now purchasing 90 new diesel buses to replace the electric buses, who in actual practice failed to be effective. This is Maryland, folks, certainly not the paragon of red states either, and even they said this isn't working, unquote, and reversed course when they realized that millions of dollars had been wasted on a migration to electric school buses. Honorable mention. From the Rogue program on Monday with V, Algo, and myself, we covered the market craziness last Monday and related details from both Saudi Arabia and Japan. I'd like to raise an interesting idea raised by Hobo Sermons. What if the reason Shinzo Abe, the former Japanese prime minister, was killed in 2022 occurred because he would have supported Japan taking the very steps the country did execute 2 weeks ago? Said another way, he was prevented from doing at that time what Japan is doing now regarding their unwinding, a delay of roughly 2 years. Abe was killed while campaigning for a candidate running for parliament. Abe held great sway in the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, even when he was not prime minister. He also was a strong nationalist, wanted Japan's military to have a freer flexibility to flex its muscles in the region, and in general, he's frequently upset China and South Korea considerably. It's an interesting thought by Hobo, and I appreciate him raising it. 13. On a prior program, I mentioned the significance of the number 13 when it came to Taylor Swift, among other celebrities. Equally, please keep in mind the movie Under the Silver Lake is germane as always to this sort of topic. There have been several times the number 13 is relevant to her, including events when she turned 13 years of age, the number of key concerts she's had, and similar. She's not the only one, though, where 13 plays a role. From our Western Judeo-Christian background, 13 is significant and to the negative because of 13 disciples, 12 plus Judas the betrayer, Friday the 13th of Christ's crucifixion, etc. I assure you the official church narrative on 13 is disinformation, and at the same time, this is not to say 13 is inherently good or evil, it simply is. There is a deep significance, though, and it goes way back in history. Let's return to the Egyptian belief system. When Set killed Osiris, he cut him into 14 pieces and scattered them across Egypt. However, Osiris's wife, Isis, could only find 13 of those pieces, the 14th being his manhood, so she fashioned one out of gold so he could produce a child once he was resurrected, that child being Horus, who defeated Set. It's about the number 13 as much as what constitutes the 14th item when it's celebrities or others referencing the number 13. In many situations, I don't think even they understand the significance. This is where the obelisk or the importance of obelisks comes in as a representation of the 14th piece of Osiris, who's littered throughout the modern world as much as the ancient. There's also the alternative social media reference to Hillary Clinton's confidant and campaign chair from her 2016 campaign, John Podesta. Go investigate him and various photos of him on the number 13. It is about sacred resurrection, not what we've been taught through the Judeo-Christian experience. Further, in some interpretations, it was not 14 body parts, but 42. For you fans of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, what is the meaning of life? Well, 42. Now you know where that came from. This is yet another example where the elites of our world follow sacred beliefs we're constantly trying to understand. Why public media in the form of Hollywood litters them in front of us is important. Yet, like a commentary from the movie Under the Silver Lake, is it a sacred meaning not meant for us? Begging the question, a sacred meaning meant for whom? The elites only those who have ascended, or to all of us as well. That is the journey we are on as we continue. Before your political eyes, a familiar theme, folks, and I'm not jumping on any bandwagons. Take Kamala Harris out of the equation and just insert any political variable you want. We're living in a world where no one on earth took the current vice president seriously, and then in the span of 30 days, we've rewritten history with greater ease and finesse than the entire Politburo of the Soviet Union. It's like I'm watching in real time the Soviet government rehabilitate someone Stalin killed in the purges. Folks, if they can do this for her, they could have done it for Dan Quayle, and they can do it for literally anyone. Think of what that kind of influence enables. But wait, there's more. I'm speaking purely in theoretical terms, in case the government is listening, but the following popped into my mind the other day. What if Kamala Harris is not around this fall, a la her own Pennsylvania moment? What if that was the plan? Not just Donald, but eliminating her too. I think that may have been one of the plans, and it went sideways when the bullet missed the PA. Think of what could be accomplished in the United States politically and socially if both candidates have left this world. Not only does that open the nomination to Hillary or others, but the potential to upset the social fabric is nearly limitless. Now you can claim others, them, they are after America. My news feed is already citing Iran 2 to 3 times a day already for everything from stolen documents of the Donald to bad weather. Maybe some shadowy domestic group can be blamed as well. Just a thought. I'll dig in this a little later in relation to California. However, given the current path we're on, it looks likely that the debates will show she's weak and unprepared. And then, of course, they'll stick someone else in there for the good of the country.
Like, how many times could they get a new candidate in, Veles?
I don't know. And, you know, there's folks who pointed out Harry Honkanen, thank you. Yes, The 13th Floor, great film. Um,
Oh, by the way, Susan Wojcicki, the former head of YouTube, passed away over the weekend. I don't know if you knew that.
I saw that.
Yep. She was turbo cancer.
Yeah, and you also saw what she was in charge of.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Pinky finger to lips like Dr. Evil. Right. It also goes to the comment being made in certain circles about the plane crash in Brazil. Oh, you can't be serious that you think that that plane was crashed because of all those what do you call it, those cancer specialists who were on board. I'm not saying it was. I'm not saying it isn't. I'm just saying it's an odd coincidence.
Wow, I did not know that.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I'm watching. I saw the video that ATR just literally part of its wing was lopped off and it just fell out of the sky in a total stall.
Yeah, evidently there were 8 cancer specialists on board who foster alternative approaches
Wow.
in cancer. It's kind of like we were having a discussion on Discord among a couple of us about the little grid that shows like 30 different people who all died right before, let's just say, because we're on YouTube, let's just say before the events of 2020, who were all microbiologists and experts in vaccines.
Yes. Correct.
Who all left this earth suddenly. Yes, Hubbo, thank you. Don't forget who her sister is either. Immigration. I use the word loosely because nearly all countries have a legal process for immigration, and what we're witnessing globally is large-scale population moves. What is occurring in the West is literally to ignore the rule of law around legal immigration and beat down any government official or citizen who raises concerns about it. There's a lot of chatter out there about the why behind it. There are some loud voices out there, especially in the U.S., worried about military-aged men on U.S. soil of Chinese extraction. Unless we have real data to the contrary, that's disinformation, folks. Why do I say that? Because another reference for military-aged men is working-age men. Not to mention reports coming out now about yet another incredibly violent gang is on U.S. soil, this time from Venezuela.
Yep.
Then we have the narrative who I subscribe to about such a flood weakens the social fabric by design because removing the emotion from the topic, your country's infrastructure is simply overwhelmed. This being a tactic of the Swiss against assets of the London Corporation, and those assets being Europe and the United States, as well as Israel. We also have George Friedman's often covered narrative around the people who want cheap labor in the United States are better organized than those trying to follow the rule of law. Another word for cheap labor in Veles's book, which I've said often, is slavery, because that's what this is, slavery, literally. There's an additional interpretation as there are layers to the situation. I thank Carl Denninger for shedding some light on it. I posted a link on Wednesday from his homepage with that view. As soon as I read what he had to say, I smacked my head and felt like an idiot. Yet another truth was right in front of our faces the whole time. There's a lot to what he's saying, and his article is rather lengthy, and you can find it on the following website, https://market-ticker.org. Carl's contention is several things. By the way, there's a bunch of articles on that page, so you may have to scroll through to find the one I'm talking about. Carl's contention is several things. First, there's a view many were hoping artificial intelligence products would help companies sell more subscription-based services and goods. I've covered the whole subscription topic ad nauseum. There's a massive flaw with that logic, and it deals with demographics as much as economics. It's not a function of better marketing. It's a function of the U.S. population and its capacity to spend. Said more bluntly, you cannot make people have kids even with child tax credits. Given the current costs involved and several factors, people are strongly avoiding having kids. Secondly, the average person must be able to afford these things. Therefore, an exhausted buying public and a native population who's not growing, you do what? One of many reasons, and I mean that, because there are many reasons behind it, you increase the population of a country through population movement. Can that new population purchase higher end items? Of course not. However, when you give them U.S. government funds, and we've seen a ton of stories about that, to get them started so they can take lower wage jobs, you're priming the pump. They can increase your country's population and by proxy increase the total number of lower end purchases being made. You can see the immense flaw in this approach because it goes to my frequent narrative about what factors go into gross domestic product. For every dollar the government spends, we get a lot less back in return. The only way you grow an economy is through new businesses and employment through that activity. Using the formula I often talk about for gross domestic product, consumption plus investment plus government spending, and then exports minus imports, you get much better returns in the free market from consumption, the letter C, and investment, the letter I, than government spending, which is the letter G in that formula. The government forcing economic growth is one of the worst forms of socialism. They're funding these inflows of people via Department of Defense money. That's how committed they are. Never mind, you've brought people into the country who do not understand its culture and laws, and in some cases care about neither. Poland, the CIA, and Ukrainian arms. Back to Ukraine again. There's complexity behind Poland's NATO membership and the degree to which they support it. Poland has been carved up before by various powers in Europe and were hosed by the Western powers in 1939. As a result, I never interpret Polish foreign policy as completely one-sided. It's complex. Further, don't forget Poland has told the West, no matter how things turn out in Ukraine, Poland wants Ukrainian territory as the price for their support. Namely, included with that territory is a very large city called Lviv, who was Polish once, but now sits in Ukraine. In Covert Action magazine this summer, there was an article about Poland's involvement in arms transfers via NATO and the CIA into Ukraine. The journey of discovery began with two companies with shady backgrounds named Noetic International and RKW Strategic Services. Both companies claim they're involved in revolutionary waste energy technology. It turns out RKW is headed by an American of Polish background with prior history working for the Defense Intelligence Agency, a man named Robert Christoph, whose background includes DIA assignments in Iraq and CIA work in Afghanistan. But wait, there's more. When he was 48 years old, he left those agencies and went to work for some old friends of mine. He went to Booz Allen. Then in 2014, he set up his company, RKW. RKW has several ties to firms based in Poland beyond Noetic. When you dig into RKW's work in waste energy, it evidently included truck transportation of weapons across all of Europe into Ukraine. Sri Lanka and Bulgaria are caught up in these arms transfers as well. The article points out the vagaries of the import and export of these weapons, cover companies, and money laundering. Metals and investing. You may have noticed some weirdness in the metals markets. Note my comments from last week Monday about the state of governments acquiring raw materials as physical assets to bolster their currencies. That's different than materials for industrial production. No matter the degree to which governments force and cajole their publics to purchase electric vehicles, it's not happening. Either folks are rejecting further purchases beyond those they've already made, or they've turned away from the concept entirely. Maybe a hybrid at most, but never a full electric. Note also what I said about the EU is telling people to do in Europe versus what is actually happening. The result per oilprice.com is overall metals demand has been flat for things like cobalt, lithium, and nickel. For that matter, I would throw in copper too for the charging stations who have to be built. There's a parallel here for those of us old enough to remember the supposed boom planned nuclear power plant builds in the 1970s. That was until the 3 Mile Island accident. But what happened on the front end? There was a huge surge in uranium mining in the 1970s and processing it into nuclear power plant fuel. Fuel for power plants who were never built. This created a ton of processed fuel lying around with no place to go. That stuff is kind of dangerous to keep on the shelf, waiting for a home. Good thing Ronald Reagan came along and wanted to build all those nuclear missiles and nuclear-powered warships for the Navy. So now we have a repeat in the electric vehicle space, and note the school bus story at the front end of today's program. They wanted to force demand in the market and planned for it by massive investment in mining and stockpiling of the needed metals. Several investors thought they could make a buck on that, and certain elites sponsored it as well. Reality's been another matter, and you better believe folks are losing money because of it. Even as a pro-oil industry website, their story on this topic followed the party line about the quote-unquote confusion, why people will not adopt electric vehicles and saving the earth from carbon dioxide and all the rest of it. The impediments identified are the cost of the electric vehicles themselves, infrastructure to charge them, and concern about the range of the vehicles. By the way, according to the website Jalopnik, Rivian trucks are losing $32,000 per vehicle sold, and Jalopnik is a pro-EV automotive website. The takeaway is adjusting your investments accordingly if you invested in this sector, and speak with your investment professional, as we are not providing investment advice here at Rogue. Equally, when things reach the bottom, you may have a buying opportunity. On a related note, because of the reality of EVs and the entire renewables sector, liquid natural gas continues to boom with huge investments by big oil firms. Move on out of there, Jed. For those of you who remember black and white TV shows, you'll know the reference to the Beverly Hillbillies TV line. Many of you know this from a few discussions on Discord. Chevron simply can't take it anymore. They're moving their headquarters out of the state of California and moving it to Texas. Chevron was in California for 140 years and simply can't take the bureaucracy and extensive regulations anymore in that state. The CEO and vice chairman of the company plan to be in Houston by the end of 2024, with the rest of the company moved there within 5 or less years. Not to worry, though, because California's governor, Gavin Newsom, continues to state California's business climate has never been better. Like I often, yes, and by the way, V and I both have been on the ground in California a couple of times, and we know that. To quote a famous comedian, that is a lie. Like I often say, California may be a $3 trillion economy, but when the state's revenue deficit is $73 billion, at least as of today's program, even with a $3 trillion economy, you're going to feel $73 billion. The governor of California says the deficit is only $38 billion, but the California Legislative Analyst's Office says it's $73 billion. And that's a state agency, by the way. The main culprit, declining corporate tax revenues. And that was before Chevron left the state, a company with roughly $200 billion in annual revenue. Not to forget, in 2023, around 20 billionaire families in Northern California moved to Kemmerer, Wyoming, to be closer to Bill Gates and his proprietary nuclear power plant. Their net worth was around $60 billion. This stuff all adds up, folks. As the California Legislative Analyst's Office is a state agency, the deficit figure of $73 billion may still be conservative. In all reality, California's deficit may in fact be closer to $100 billion. One final item, not to beat up on the West Coast too much. Robert Kiyosaki of Rich Dad Poor Dad fame weighed in last week on California. To oversimplify, he had 2 main points. His first point was, without radical change, nothing can save the state of California, and it's going to continue to decline. His second point was, political views be damned. California is a bellwether of the rest of the United States. And the simple reality is, if California is in trouble, we're in trouble, no matter how much people don't want to hear that. Why? Well, several reasons. Their state GDP is immense in relation to other U.S. states and the U.S. itself. We have to remember that California's gross domestic product is larger than some country, or quite a few countries. We cannot ignore the problems like they're a province in Canada. California has often been followed by other states in relation to state policies, particularly when it comes to car emissions, among other things. This is the famous California Air Resources Board, or CARB. California's policies have been implemented with disastrous consequences the last 10 years by Washington State and Oregon, among others. Lastly, a Veles comment. I've been on this earth a few decades, and California has always had a balance at times, even though it was a battleground between the views of what we loosely call the political left and the political right. As I've said on other shows, in the 1970s and 1980s, whether it was Washington, D.C. or California, the argument was about how much government versus how much private sector was the right balance. The last 10 years, it's about ditching the entire government and private sector model towards something bordering on a centralized economic planning on par with the Soviet Union. That's a major difference. There's not a single shred of evidence to show what occurred and is occurring in California is truly driven at the state level. Let me say that again. Regardless of what you may think and what you hear coming out of California, forces outside that state and this country are doing this. I'm on the ground frequently in California for my job, and I can assure you it may look and feel like what we're hearing is coming out of the state government in Sacramento, but that's not the case. Everything happening in California and other major U.S. states and cities is entirely being directed by people outside the United States. And no, it's not China or Russia. In many respects, it's Switzerland, and don't forget that. I saw it factually with the campus protests. We are under attack, folks. Nuclear. Speaking of nuclear power, the United States and Sweden have signed an agreement to support the development of new nuclear technology approaches. What do you want to bet that includes all those micro-reactor R&D facilities I've been talking about? Sweden has stated they have huge ambitions in the deployment of nuclear power in their country. I find that amusing as they're an EU member, and every major EU member like Germany and France have moved away from nuclear power because of pollution or whatever in favor of solar and wind. Aha. But Sweden is moving toward nuclear power. It was always simply going to be who gets paid and when by the new technology and when it comes out. Money like water. The United States has abandoned a military base in Niger in Africa who cost us $110 million to build. This was Niger Air Base 201, who previously hosted hundreds of U.S. troops and a fleet of UAVs, which has now been evacuated on the orders of the military junta who took over Niger. It cost $110 million to build the place and $30 million a year to sustain it since 2019. And there may be more. Intel. Noting some of our prior Rogue coverage about the Intel Corporation, the latest is this. Intel continues to have problems with new chip rollouts, and of course, all during a downturn in the industry. Intel's performing poorly, even given the current market conditions. A week or two ago, they announced a very large cost-cutting push of 15,000 layoffs and the suspension of a dividend, and the latter one is probably bigger in the eyes of the market than a layoff. Intel's trying to keep up with the huge need right now for artificial intelligence-capable chips, and note my coverage of that data center and AI topic the last few months, and I have a related story who follows. To keep up with that demand, Intel's been leveraging manufacturing in Ireland, who's more expensive than their operations in Oregon. Right now, the company does not believe they're going to have strong margins again until 2026. So why am I even delving into this? Several reasons. First, there's a class action lawsuit brewing by at least two major law firms against Intel. The reason is microcode for their 13th and 14th generation chips may be faulty when it comes to voltage that can cause the chips to fail. It appears this happened because Intel was trying to achieve the highest out-of-the-box chip speeds in the market. Second, recall Intel is building that very significant chip manufacturing plant in Ohio, a project who's now in limbo. No one in the media seems to know what the heck is going on with that project. Recall that it's a $20 billion investment just to build that plant alone and leveraging a lot of high-speed internet networks and data centers in the state capital of Columbus. I have direct knowledge of the facilities up in Columbus as far as telecommunications infrastructure is concerned, and I can understand why Intel wanted that plant there. As I noted on a prior show, Intel has said they think the plant will now go live in 2027 or 2028 instead of 2025. That's significant. Third is the elephant in the room. Intel is an Israeli company, regardless of what the market thinks, and the leadership of that company has said as much. Plus, Israel's influence on Ohio basically makes that state a base of operations for Israel in the U.S., and has been since the mid-1960s. Then a fourth rather odd item. The CEO of the company has been quoting a lot lately from the Bible. Some of you might say, well, okay, Veles, that's a little odd, but in today's era, that's no big deal. Well, several things. Item one, it's an Israeli-controlled company, so the New Testament, not to be indelicate, is not their thing.
No.
Item two, why the sudden biblical references is that's not going to gain you any ground with the IT press. Local folks in Ohio are similar. It won't hurt, but it just seems an odd thing to do.
Right.
Then item three on a personal level for me, I remember the heady days of when a senior executive I knew came back from a prayer breakfast meeting with Bernie Ebbers, the then CEO of MCI WorldCom. This was early in 2001 when the telecommunications industry, and IT by proxy, was about to get decimated. Any of us who'd been around a while knew, like animals in the forest, something was coming. We just couldn't quite put our paws on it. This VP of sales informed those I knew during a prayer breakfast that the CEO, Bernie Ebbers, held up printouts of the company's financials. Essentially, he held up the books of the company in his hands at the breakfast meeting and announced to everybody in the room the future of the company was in God's hands. Further, he could not for the life of him understand why there were all these irregularities in the company's financials. This VP made her way to the women's restroom to run some cold water on her hands and splash it on her face because of the horror of her realization. Several other VP women came into the restroom a little while later. She looked at them and said, "What are we going to do?" They looked at her straight in the eye and in complete seriousness said, "Well, it's like Bernie said, it's in God's hands, but I'm sure it'll all work out." I changed the names a bit on this story when I retold it to my MBA program classmates a number of years ago. You don't need to be in a bunker with Adolf Hitler in 1945 to know everyone is in denial about a situation. Many certainly were at MCI WorldCom until the federal marshals rolled in a short while later and literally arrested nearly every C-level executive in that company. Am I saying in any way that's what's going on at Intel? Not in the slightest. I'm just saying, based on several criteria, including my own life experiences, this does give me a bad feeling. Data centers and artificial intelligence. I've been covering this topic for a while, including the massive load and power and resources to support artificial intelligence for many months. This week, imagine my amusement at Zero Hedge having an article covering this very topic. Plus, noting what I just said about Intel, it's worth noting that the chip maker NVIDIA is also having problems rolling out their artificial intelligence-enabled chips. That sector is going to be pushing those chips any way they can, including using partners to get that stuff out the door. If I were running data centers or anybody else using these types of advanced chips, including university research departments, I'd be checking the warranty and SLA language very carefully right now. These chips are going to have problems, folks, and the firms using them and organizations using them better be on the ball monitoring the software updates to what's known as the BIOS, the basic input-output on those chips. Per the article, data centers are now being described as the factories of the future, given AI systems they will support. Terms are also being thrown about stating that the chip war over AI chips may become a cloud war. That being cloud service providers and the criticality of their data centers in supporting those offerings. Not that the cloud sector was hurting for revenue. Again, we're not providing investment advice, but you may want to research both large and niche cloud providers as part of your investments. This is not just the U.S. activity. As the article points out, several other countries are also investing in their AI-capable data centers, including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kazakhstan, interestingly, and Malaysia, not to mention China as well. How much of this is hype like electric vehicles? Well, we'll see. The thing I am glad for is my brothers and sisters in the IT space who might be worried about their jobs have the opportunity now to look at data centers as a fallback opportunity if their employment options suddenly go into free agency. Bear with me just a second. Archaeology. Though the article didn't have the groundbreaking language in it I felt there should have been, it did show up on Daily Mail last week anyway. In an article titled "Archaeologists Discover the World's Oldest Calendar That Could Rewrite the Birth of Civilization," they profiled work from researchers at the University of Edinburgh. Go Scotland. However, if you've listened to Rogue and my program specifically, you know I've been covering the topic of alternative archaeology for some time. Of course, the site in question is none other than Gobekli Tepe. I know there are strong feelings in the audience for and against Graham Hancock and his focus on the site. I'll simply say he's done a lot of work on it, among many others, including Freddie Silva. Hancock has been very loud in his last two books and his Netflix program about the lentils at various Tepe sites being complex calendars. He also has said the purpose of the complex calendar system is to give a warning about our past and our future. Am I seeking he gets his credit for the Daily Mail article? Not the slightest, as his books are public record, and if he wants to jump in on this, he can. Equally, I've already found several news sources indicating Graham Hancock has been very supportive of the Edinburgh team, and he actually knows the lead researcher. No, my point is the Daily Mail is about as mainstream as you can get until Fox or CNN starts covering it from a U.S. news perspective. The main takeaway from the researchers in Edinburgh is they believe they've ID'd the timekeeping system at the site, at least one of them. There were pictures in the article referencing what appears to be decorative marks on the lintels, who in fact are increments of months, days, and solstices. Then they drop the big one. They believe they've confirmed that the site identifies a comet impact on the Earth 13,000 years ago. They believe the event was memorialized because it focused primitive hunter-gatherers to shift to a more agrarian and organized society. I have a million problems with that statement, but no worries, it's their research. The article dovetailed another Daily Mail article from June of this year discussing a planetary defense consortium who are concerned about our ability to defend the Earth. Don't forget from a prior program, the World Economic Forum invested $15 million in the Turkish Dogus Group, who works with the Turkish Ministry of Culture at the site. There continue to be rumors that the WEF would like the work there and at Gunung Padang in Indonesia to slow down or stop entirely, begging the question why. We'll see where this all takes us. MK Ultra topic. Before I delve into the book, Thanks for the Memories by Bryce Taylor, in continuance of my prior program, let me say this. A couple of folks pointed this out in the comments section of my prior program, as well as in DMs on Discord. I certainly felt it was valid, so let me raise it here. What I'm covering about MKUltra and have covered about MKUltra and MK Delta programs is, as I often say, a primer on the subject. It's a high-level coverage of data points about those programs and their goals and influence or downright control. Much of the literature, though, tends to focus on one of two areas. The first being the inception of those programs in the 1940s to the hearings of the U.S. government in the 1970s. Then the period beyond the 1970s, who is usually not referred to in terms of MKUltra or Delta specifically, but influence operations, cyber control, and a host of other words and terms. What is important is to understand is books like what I've covered, the last two programs, as well as some prior programs, are to provide a foundation, to provide a baseline and color on the topic prior to things going dark in the 1970s. Dark officially, at least. The point being, all this stuff continued beyond the official statements of, and I quote, that program was shut down in the 1970s, stop talking about it. I'd further tell you much of it moved into the realm of cyber, and specifically things like frequency and modulation of color and sound via your computers, television, and your cell phone. Especially your cell phone, because depending on whether you're actively or passively monitored, that little camera on the front of your cell phone is watching you. It's watching you intently. They want to see the degree to which your eyes and facial expressions react. Remember what I said a few shows ago about, are the eyes of a person you're viewing on a screen uniform or not uniform? If they're not uniform, it's AI. Recall also what I've said on a couple of other programs. The whole congressional testimony thing by Nintendo executives in the 1980s or 1990s, when the executives were asked, is it true your games give off a barely perceptible audio signal in the game that stimulates the brain the further a player makes progress in the game? The executives essentially shrugged and said yes, because that kind of product isn't illegal in Japan. Of course, it wasn't exactly illegal in the US either. It's just no one publicly was going to admit that. Also, this is not speculation, folks, or solely content I've reviewed from the public domain. You have to recall the research groups I used to work for, including many conferences on practices and approaches where these topics were discussed openly. In fact, I've attended conferences on how to be more effective in social manipulation, because the fear in the room was someone else had already surpassed us in their expertise. In conclusion, the entire field of this kind of study has evolved. Is torture and death still part of it? Well, who knows? I can assure you, though, what they can accomplish through your television, movies, or your cell phone would make Orwell blush. So with that, let's turn to the book. The book, Thanks for the Memories, was written in 1999 under the pseudonym Bryce Taylor, who was in fact a woman named Susan Ford. As mentioned on my prior program, it's a physically large book at 8 by 10, and are the personal recollections of the author and her experiences. There's a lot of content in this book many people will struggle with, even if you're already familiar with the MKUltra topic. There are people in popular culture and other topics she discusses many people will find difficult. There's much about her descriptions of how she was recruited and conditioned to follow a similar pattern from others with similar experiences. It also jumps at times from certain moments in time forward and back because of how she wrote her memoirs. First, a sidebar. When I researched and worked with human rights groups, I came across a lot of psychological profiles of people who'd been harmed or lost loved ones and various forms of recovery from those events. It was inclusive of people from South America to the Middle East to Asia to the US. In fact, I wrote a rather lengthy graduate school paper that was probably 70 pages or more just on how terror and torture were used on children in Iraq as a method of state control. As a result, for many beyond therapy and a long road of recovery and redemption, the people affected at times would adopt various world philosophies, or even addictions, for lack of a better word, as mechanisms to cope. When I say addictions, I mean exchanging one addiction for another. I had a family member who was an alcoholic, and when they joined AA and got off the sauce, they became a chain smoker. When I was a kid attending AA family get-togethers, it was like a 1950s union meeting in those banquet halls. You could literally not see more than 2 feet in front of you because the cigarette smoke was so thick. So if getting off alcohol means an addiction to cigarettes, I guess you pick your poison. It's not uncommon to find human rights researchers with a drinking or smoking problem, much less harder drugs, and not to mention various passionate experiences. Sometimes getting away from the pain means hard drugs, sex, or both. Then getting off hard drugs means a softer drug like alcohol, cigarettes, or something else. You do what you have to do to hold yourself together if you've been through that kind of trauma or overcame addiction within certain boundaries, of course. With Bryce Taylor's book, her writing is littered with her deep spiritual faith. Now, I'm not suggesting in the slightest religion is a coping mechanism, again, within certain boundaries. I'm just saying for her, the thing that got her through it and out of it was a very deep spiritual faith. She's not the only one, as many survivors of MK Ultra tend to have similar beliefs. If you read the book, though, you'll find nearly every chapter littered with her personal prayers for others and deep heartfelt thoughts on her faith with this subject matter. I'm purely pointing that out for awareness should you be able to actually find a copy of this book, because it's very hard to come by. Also, should you read any criticisms of her work by people who point to her religious faith as implying she made this up. On this journey she's been on, she discusses the challenges of finding the right kind of psychologist to help people such as herself, especially in the 1970s and 1980s. Much of MK Ultra and the people affected by it was rumor and speculation, and certainly professionals were not trained who knew in those days how to help these kinds of people. The book also contains comments from psychologists who helped victims of these programs and their own disbelief and challenges they had in coming to terms with how far this goes. A parallel historical item for context I can offer is this. In Central and South America, when there are earthquakes, some of the best medical folks who can help survivors are from Argentina. The Argentinians are known for their expertise during international disasters as well. Why? Well, it's because of the country's history with decades of human rights violations and the measures that were needed by both their medical community as far as physical care as well as psychological care. Argentinian doctors and mental health professionals have developed excellent approaches who can be used to aid people harmed in disasters. This is because being trapped under rubble can do to the body and the state of mind the same thing as forms of torture. This is the kind of care these folks need with what is known as dissociative disorders. There are people who have dissociative disorders because of just natural mental development and something went sideways. Those who were in MK Ultra programs had dissociative disorders who were created by design. Again, medical professionals need to know the difference when they're treating a patient. This is also why Polly St. George, aka the Amazing Polly, has created excellent work of her own on this relative to the potential use of the band The Grateful Dead in these programs. The logo of the band with a crack in the top of the skull has been associated with MK Ultra approach known as cracking, where a primary personality of a person is broken or cracked, and the subconscious creates a second personality as a defensive mechanism. In the historical overview in the front of the book, it delves into the topic many of you are familiar thanks to Matthew Arid, among others. Yet her book is the only one I own on the subject matter who mentions the Tavistock Institute. Specifically, the Tavistock Institute had built upon prior behavioral research work who began in the late 1880s prior to Tavistock being stood up in 1921. That section of the book covers the deep connections between British aristocracy and Nazi officials in their mutual research in the field until the outbreak of World War II. From prior Rogue programs and this book, we've covered how following the war, the U.S. and other countries literally picked up where the Nazi research ended. By the way, there's an amusing historical footnote. Naval research into MK Ultra-like work began in 1947 under a program called Chatter. I note that because of the year. 1947 was the year they signed the National Security Act, creating the CIA. The Air Force became a new branch of the military, and we had all that weirdness going on in New Mexico and the White Sands area, along with Oak Ridge, Tennessee, concerning people from out of town. The book covers why women's subjects were often sought over men, and this is another data point. This book is one of the few I know where this is covered. The reasoning is because women have a higher physical tolerance for pain, and psychologically they can be made to disassociate their personality more easily than men. A Defense Intelligence Agency official noted in the book said, and I quote, "People leveraged in these programs are from all walks of life. From a homeless person on the street to the administrative assistant to an executive to a Hollywood figure to military personnel," unquote. Having individuals from all walks of society was described as the ultimate infiltration tool because assets can be layered into an organization at all levels. They can be left there to monitor what's going on until they're needed. There is detail provided as well in the book on symbols used to manage people used in these programs, who include items we've both heard about before and probably some new ones. They are the Kabbalistic tree of life, roots or root systems, infinity loops, various forms of ancient symbols, spider webs, the use of mirrors or mirror imagery, the images of glass shattering, masks, castles, mazes, demonic figures, seashells, butterflies, of course, snakes, ribbons, bows, several flower images, hourglasses, clocks, robotic figures, and the use of computer circuitry boards. Let me take a moment and speak about a couple of those images. First, yes, there were a ton of them in the movie Under the Silver Lake. When it comes to infinity loops, those are on everything from trucking company logos to the band Journey's early albums from the 1980s. Mirrors and mirror imagery. Have any of you ever seen a Harry Potter movie? That imagery appears many times in those films. Masks, well, we have Eyes Wide Shut and The Ninth Gate with Johnny Depp, among others. Butterflies, my God, that's a rogue show in and of itself, including clips of Al Roker locking up on live TV when he saw one. Same thing with hourglasses, and certainly we have that imagery in The Wizard of Oz, among others. Computer circuitry boards. Remember what I said on a program last week about Kanye West's video game few have ever heard about. If you told the non-playing character you were seeking ascension, what happened? You became a butterfly working your way through circuit boards. The rabbit hole is deep with this topic, folks. Recruitment was often from orphanages, foster care homes, or families with long histories of problems. Any of you who know Marilyn Monroe's real life story know how the foster care system destroyed her long before she met the Kennedys. Some of the supporting materials in the book point out areas of the United States where recruitment is common. It was never called out by name, but certainly my prior coverage of Boulder, Colorado came to mind. In the case of Bryce Taylor, she grew up in a wealthy area of California called Woodland Hills and claims the abuse leading to her becoming part of MK Ultra was caused by her father. In her later years, she realized one of her handlers had previously broken her father and that he too was part of the program. Her belief is that many personalities were developed in her depending on what was required. She was leveraged for prostitution, nude photos, and porn films, as well as a human recorder of information from meetings she attended or documents she was shown and told to memorize. She has been under the care of a pair of psychologists who've helped her unpack her life experiences. Included in those situations where she believes she was to deliver messages to high-level government officials, including LBJ when he was president, President Ford, President Carter, President Reagan, and George Bush Sr. Henry Kissinger, she believes, was a key handler of hers, given government officials she came into contact with, and she was also owned of a fashion by Bob Hope. She's of the belief, as are her psychologists, her children as well were leveraged in these programs. She spent many years trying to deprogram them as well. Her book describes at length the methods used to develop multiple personalities in her while she was young. This included leveraging symbolism through an extensive doll collection she was given, as well as the use of holidays. She has references to law enforcement and parochial school involvement, who, for when the book was published, predated the recent Netflix documentary called The Keepers. That program, The Keepers, being about an MK Ultra program being run out of a Catholic girls' school in Pennsylvania who went sideways, and a nun was murdered to keep the program hidden. She also references how when young girls are involved, one of the leveraged resources are beauty pageants and children's fashion shows. Obviously, we have a correlation there to John Benet Ramsey. She describes in her book how various elites purchase or sponsor some of these assets because the use of them is so widespread. That's something to make you pause. To believe U.S. intelligence is leveraging maybe 100 of these people anywhere in the country is one thing. By her description, it's in the thousands. One of her sponsors, as I mentioned, was Bob Hope. She described parties where various elites demonstrate to one another what their mind-controlled assets can do, whether memory tricks or sex used for blackmail. For those of you familiar with the multitude of stories about Laurel Canyon out in California, there's a lot on that subject as well in her book. Disney properties are mentioned several times, and she mentions something who's occurred in other literature. That being the It's a Small World ride at Disney properties has several symbolic meanings in the world of conditioning kids in these programs. I would point out her descriptions of Kissinger and Bob Hope are not passing statements of them being her handlers. She provides a ton of detail about each of them individually, the guidance they gave her and direction, including various, for lack of a better word, missions she was on or tasks she was asked to carry out. She equally has a ton of detail about how Bob Hope's house was laid out and specific international meetings of Henry Kissinger where she was present. There are chapters upon chapters of that detail. Bob Hope evidently had a lot of parties at his house where he handed these women around as party favors to his guests. That may sound shocking at first, but then remember what was said about Hugh Hefner and the Playboy Mansion. In the case of the latter, the whole thing was a CIA sexual blackmail resource for decades. Bryce Taylor describes how anyone she had sex with required her to make a full report later to her handler. If it was blackmail against blackmail against blackmail, and remember, this was all well before Jeff Epstein or our knowledge of Jeff Epstein, or for that matter, what we think we know about Jeff Epstein. There's some coverage as well about how the Rockefellers set up J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI and how Hoover in turn set up others via various forms of honey traps. She delves a lot into how Bob Hope and Kissinger utilized the Kennedy family around the time of JFK's presidency. She also discusses how Ted Kennedy was the absolute worst of all three brothers. She rattles off a ton of high-profile figures she believes were compromised by sex acts with her or by the program itself, including people such as Jane Fonda, Mickey Rooney, Barbra Streisand, Michael Jackson, Neil Diamond, and Elton John, among others. She has a whole chapter dedicated to Prince Charles, Prince Philip, and Princess Diana. She claims she and others were used to prey on Charles and break he and Diana at the direction of the Rockefellers and Kissinger. She also goes into depth describing very specific situations where she befriended Princess Diana. Some of you may be familiar outside of this book. It is known through several sources Kissinger was closely involved with Diana in various international campaigns, including her mine removal campaign. Bryce Taylor claims in her book she reviewed documents demonstrating the United States had already developed directed energy weapons. What is important about that is she claims she reviewed those documents in the early 1980s, which was long before the topic even began to come out by the later 1990s. The last item worth sharing from her book is her deep coverage of Bob Hope's properties in the Santa Monica Mountains. Around the time he died, there was a big dust-up over who was going to inherit that property or where it was going to go. Her claim in the book was the transfer of the property was not the real issue. Those properties had been extensively used for years by intelligence agencies and others to train people in these programs. They didn't want anyone acquiring those properties who shouldn't have them and might discover some things. This led me again to another movie reference, which is Bad Times at the El Royale, for those of you who've seen the movie and understand the reference I'm implying. The other item her book caused me to consider was this. Some of you may recall the famous Patty Hearst of the powerful Hearst family being caught up in a strange terrorist organization called the Symbionese Liberation Army in 1974. She was involved in bank robberies and related, supporting that group after they kidnapped her. Based on Bryce Taylor's book and what we now know about the NXIVM cult, it begs the question whether all of this is related. Like the purpose of NXIVM was to target wealthy and well-educated women who can still be broken and made to perform acts against their will. Is everything in her recollection true? Well, it's hard to say. When someone has survived this much trauma, there will be many factors to consider. I certainly saw that in the diaries and Truth and Reconciliation Commission testimony of human rights victims in South America. It's not that they were intentionally lying. It's just they've been through so much trauma, the recollection of certain events wasn't on target. The book does provide details on MK Ultra from several angles of the topic, not covered in other literature. So if you have an interest in this type of topic matter, it might be worth seeing if you can find a copy of the book. On a future program, I'll be covering the book Raven Rock, who describes the continuity of government planning from its inception to at least the 2000s. I had some involvement with what they call COOP, continuity of operations, with some of the stuff I did for the Department of Defense. I've already found some interesting snippets in the book Raven Rock that made me raise an eyebrow and say, "Oh, that's why that's why we were working on that." And as I said at the opening of today's program, I'm not kidding. I really will not have a show on Friday the 16th. One final ask for all of you, which is if you all wouldn't mind sending a copy of today's program off Rumble or Twitch, or God willing, we stay on YouTube. But if you wouldn't mind sending out a copy of our program today to other folks, I'd like to see if we can bring our numbers up a bit and also introduce our content to some new folks, some people you may know that might benefit or like to catch us occasionally. I met a couple of people this weekend who I hadn't seen in a while, and each and every one of them looked at me and said, still getting your shows, haven't had a chance to listen to it yet. I'm several shows behind, very sorry. It's like, hey, that's fine. And you'll definitely want to catch that show that V and Algo and I did last Monday. That was a real barn burner. So with that, V, first, before we wrap up, what shows do we have planned this week? I know we won't have Gus. Do we have Harley and or you and Algo?
Oh, we have me and Algo. We have Singleton again, probably tomorrow. But it's pretty light week, being the
Okay.
summer. The summer schedule is going to be hither and yon.
Yeah, it's been nice to catch John Singleton again last week. So
Yeah.
okay. Well, everybody have a good rest of your week. Take care. Hug your loved ones. Be careful before hugging a stranger. Um, and I'll see you in a week and change. V, did you have any other items you wanted to raise while we're
Yeah,
all
I mean,
here?
I think you touched base on the whole AI thing, and the more I'm looking into it, the more it's. I think 90 some odd percent of all this AI stuff that these companies are doing is just marketing BS. I don't think it's literally what they've done in the crypto industry, where you got all these guys claiming to have next technology, this and this coin will improve invoicing, and this coin will improve streaming, and so on and so forth. And at the end of the day, it was all vaporware. Do you sense the same, Veles?
I do, and I know that folks, not to jump on any bandwagons. Yes, Zero Hedge had on their paid for service. I know Mike Moore has said similar. Um, from conversations I've had with folks I know in the IT space, beyond the massive drive, as we've discussed very often, at the data center level, and why the computer, because these chips need to like handle even more processing than they've ever had to manage to support AI systems. But V raises a very good question, and it's been asked by many of us, which is, but what's the real value?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm using it with some of my clients right now for documentation development, for other things. Candidly, I had some emergency planning stuff we did for one of my clients recently where I needed an outline of a topic area that's like kind of hard. And it's one of those classic things of, I had a whole bunch of universities all saying, man, Veles, if you come up with something, let us know. Cause everybody wants to know what the plan should be for something like that, but we have no idea how to even start. In 15 minutes, I got an AI system to print out something that I thought, that's not half bad. In fact, it's
Mm.
pretty damn good. And I circulated it among a number of universities, and they all came back and said, shit, who wrote this? Who prepared this? And I'm like, well, the software did, which means I don't know how it extrapolated this, but I said, now I did use a non-traditional AI tool to do it, but the bigger question is, we saw this too, and again, not to age myself, we saw this too with big iron in the 1970s. Everybody is sitting around saying, well, only banks are going to use it, only insurance companies are going to use it, they're going to use it for big number crunching and this, that, and the other. And IBM's famous statement about who the hell needs a personal computer. And yes, I know it's unpopular, and yes, I know it's a little risque of me to say it, but you talk to anybody in the IT industry who's been around and really knows, if you ask them, well, what really led to massive growth in computational power, chip speeds, memory, and this, that, and the other, and internet speeds? Behind closed doors, they'll tell you video games and porn. That's pretty much what it was. And then, strangely enough, once all that visual excellence was developed, both for video games and porn, it was amazing that people were like, hey, beyond porn, we could use this for marketing. We could use this for other things. So it's like the law of unintended consequences. There's people use these systems for what they think they should be used for. And, it's like the famous story about the adhesive used on Post-it notes. When 3M originally came up with the adhesive, they couldn't find a use for it because it was sticky, but not sticky enough, until one of their VPs said, hey, I think if we made a little notepad and it's just got this gentle adhesive on the back that doesn't tear off paint or anything, this would be pretty valuable. So we'll have to see. But yeah, it's like what I said about minerals and mining, V. I mean, big money, big people, big politicians, all even the Vorlons and the Shadows, Davos and London Corporation, all jumped into that stuff. And in the end, it's like, oh crap, it's flaming out on the tarmac. We can see it right there from the control tower. It's on fire on the runway. It's not working. And then it's like, okay, well, we'll try it at the municipal level. We'll try it with school buses and city buses. And it's like, nope, that's not working either. Never mind the fact that what was the other thing about the school bus issue, because it wasn't just Maryland. Several northeastern states have moved away from school buses, even though they have a stated state policy to adopt them. What was the problem?
Yep.
Cold weather. Cold weather. It's like when I was working with Apple back in 2014, and they're all bitching at me about, well, why don't you Midwesterners drive more electric cars? I'm like, winter? Because we have temperatures at 20 degrees where the battery just went to half its life, which is not its problem, but it's a battery. That's what happens in cold weather.
Physics. Exactly, it's physics.
There's this little thing called physics. Oh, and we don't live in a place that is 70 degrees every day with the sun out.
Yeah,
so
California.
When it comes to AI, my fear is twofold. One, the things it could be used that would be of benefit will get missed. And we're going to dump a ton of money on data centers, and we're going to dump a ton of money on power plants, which also may be exploited by the globalists, who knows. And then everybody's going to sit back and say, just like 2000, the year 2000 problem, we spent all this money on nothing, which equally is not true. The alternative, which is far scarier, is God forbid they should use this technology against all of us, which I definitely am concerned about. But as I've often said on many shows, and I say it with hyperbole and a sense of humor, but there's a seriousness to my sense of humor. If you knew what really the data center up in Utah for the NSA is capable of, you wouldn't really worry about what they're going to do with these data centers. But yeah, we'll have to see. But I think, again, I hate to even make statements like this. There is so much desperation in the free market right now. Everybody, is just trying to find something to invest in. And I know you see it more directly, and Algo sees it more directly in the work you do. And I've got family members who are financial planners, and they've got clients who also are losing their minds about, am I diversified enough? It's like, well, you have $1 million in assets, and literally every dollar of your assets is tied up with something different. How much more diversified can I make you? Well, where's everything going? Here's a quarter. Why don't you flip that and tell me where the hell it's
in a quarter. Oh my God.
I told you all in the spring of 2023, I spent some time, and I'm making air quotes here on Veles's computer desk chair. I went down south, we'll leave it at that, and hung out with some people of amazing high net worth who also had hired their own private research firms and think tanks and others to advise them. And these firms are not well known, and they don't have websites. And it's kind of like some of the think tanks I worked with in government. And these people have lots of money, and they've spent that money on people that are really good at figuring things out. And the number one takeaway that each and every person I spoke to told me was, this was a lot easier before 2008. We knew what was coming in 2008. We knew it would be heavily real estate focused. We knew if we just wait until the storm passes, we'll be able to buy up whole sections of streets in Florida cities for pennies on the dollar. This time, and I know V sees the same thing. I mean, you got billionaires out there that are like, I don't know, do I want a municipal bond in Albania? I mean, it's like, couldn't hurt.
I mean, Chelsea Clinton's husband is selling it.
Right. What the hell else have I got to invest in? I'll tell you what, though, boy, if you could find a way to get somebody into orbit to go get our astronauts down, you could make a quick buck.
Oh my God, man, it's unbelievable. Unbelievable. Veles, thank you so much for being on with us, and thank you for sharing all this information with us, folks. Again, go back and listen to this interview again, because there's a lot to cover here. I want to thank all you all for listening in, and I'll confirm with all of you if Gus is going to be on either this week or next week. So keep it locked and loaded right here. And that being said, we're over now. Cheers, everyone.